The sky over Cedar Falls, Iowa was a deepening gray when 14-year-old Rachel Whitmore laced up her skates for what should have been a simple afternoon on the ice. It was December 14th, 1996, just 11 days before Christmas, and the local kids had gathered at Briar Ridge Pond like they did every winter. The surface of the frozen lake shimmered beneath their blades, smooth from a week of cold fronts and occasional snow flurries. Rachel, wrapped in a pink scarf and hand-me-down coat, smiled as she drifted past her best friend Maddie, then disappeared toward the far end of the pond. No one would see her again after that. At 5:30 p.m., when most kids were packing up and parents were honking in the parking lot, Rachel was simply gone. Her skates were found hours later, abandoned at the far shoreline, neatly placed beside a tree stump. Her scarf lay coiled beside them, stiff from frost. The police initially thought she had wandered off or fallen through the ice, but there were no cracks, no open water, no footprints. Just silence. That was the moment Cedar Falls stopped feeling like a small, safe town and started living with a question no one could answer. The hours after Rachel's disappearance blurred into panic and sirens. Her father, Alan Whitmore, had arrived at the pond, expecting to see his daughter laughing with friends. Instead, he saw police tape and red flashing lights reflected in the snow. Her mother, Joanne, collapsed in the front hallway when officers delivered the news. That night, volunteers and deputies swept the woods with thermal drones and hounds trained to detect even a hint of human scent. They found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no dropped phone or torn fabric. Her bag was still in the back of Alan's truck, untouched, with her clarinet club folder and unopened pack of gum still inside. What disturbed authorities most was the orderliness of the scene. Rachel's boots were side by side. Her scarf was folded over itself. It was as if she had undressed herself and walked willingly into thin air. Search parties returned each day for the next 2 weeks, combing the area with increasing desperation. But Cedar Falls was bitterly cold that winter, and time was unforgiving. By January, all official efforts slowed, and the national coverage dwindled. Rachel Whitmore had vanished, and the world had already moved on. Despite the freezing temperatures, friends and neighbors refused to let Rachel's memory melt away. Flyers bearing her photograph hung on utility poles and bus stops. Her picture stayed pinned on the school bulletin board long after students returned from holiday break. Alan took a leave of absence from work and spent every waking moment organizing local search groups, reaching out to retired detectives, and writing letters to journalists who had once taken interest in the story. Joanne, meanwhile, withdrew almost entirely. She sat at the kitchen table with the same cup of tea each morning, staring out the window toward the road, waiting for headlights that never came. She stopped going to church. She stopped answering the phone. When the pastor visited, she asked if it was possible for a person to feel someone vanish in real time. She claimed the moment she heard the clock strike 6 that evening, something inside her hollowed out. No one knew how to respond. Rachel was her only child. She had been born after 3 miscarriages and was named after Joanne's grandmother who survived the Dust Bowl. She was quiet, curious, a little shy around strangers. She had plans to be a veterinarian someday. Cedar Falls had known her since she was in diapers, and now no one knew where she had gone. As the year turned, the theories grew darker. Some believed Rachel had met a stranger near the woods, though there were no tire marks or foreign footprints. Others suspected she had fallen victim to someone she knew, maybe even someone from town. Investigators interviewed classmates, teachers, even extended relatives. The pond's maintenance man, a 52-year-old war veteran named Roy Glenshire, was questioned twice, but never arrested. His alibi held. Rumors spread in the high school like wildfire as kids whispered names of possible suspects in lunch lines and gym lockers. The lack of answers gave space for imagination to fill the void, and that made people uneasy. Parents began walking their children to school again. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted tight. Briar Ridge Pond was closed indefinitely, deemed unsafe for recreation. A sign was posted at the edge of the trail leading to the lake. Warning: thin ice, do not enter. But those who lived in Cedar Falls knew the danger had never been the ice. It was something else, something far more unsettling. And what no one knew then was that 17 years would pass before the first real clue would arrive. It would come without warning in a plain envelope. And when it did, everything would change. Alan Whitmore stood at the edge of the old pond a week after the last official search. Snow had covered the skates someone left by the shoreline, and Rachel's scarf was no longer visible beneath the drift. The silence felt louder than ever, and he realized he had been holding his breath without knowing it. No birdsong, no distant hum of traffic. Just wind. Every morning since Rachel vanished, he had woken before sunrise and driven the same route to Briar Ridge. Joanne had stopped asking where he was going. The tension between them stretched like thin ice across their quiet home. He feared it might crack. Their conversations became short and mechanical, mostly revolving around meals and bills. The house no longer smelled like cinnamon or detergent. It smelled like paper. Newspaper clippings, police reports, forgotten coffee. Every photograph of Rachel was moved to the dining room table, where Joanne had made a shrine of sorts. It was the only place in the house where she sat anymore. Her chair faced the front door. She believed Rachel might walk through it someday. Alan could not bear to tell her he had already changed the locks, just in case someone else tried first. Joanne rarely left the house after the second week. She stopped attending Sunday service and ignored calls from friends who had tried to offer comfort. She told her sister Ruth that her body hurt, but doctors found nothing wrong. She did not want answers. She wanted her daughter. On the rare days when Joanne ventured outside, it was only to replace the missing posters that kept getting peeled off the supermarket windows. Her hand trembled as she pressed them against the cold glass, smoothing out the wrinkles. Rachel's smile stared back at her, young and hopeful, in the same windbreaker she wore the day she vanished. Joanne spoke less and less each day. She no longer made eye contact with Alan. He feared she blamed him. He had picked Rachel up from school many times before, but that day he had let her walk with Maddie. That tiny decision haunted him like a shadow. At night, he could hear Joanne whispering to herself. She repeated Rachel's full name, as if trying to keep it alive. Maddie, Rachel's best friend, had become withdrawn. Her parents took her out of school for 2 weeks, hoping rest might help her process the trauma. But when she returned, she was not the same. She spoke only when spoken to, and refused to go near the pond. She had told the police everything she remembered. They were skating. Rachel had complained about her knee. She had stopped to rest. Maddie said she looked away for a few seconds to tie her glove tighter. When she turned back, Rachel was gone. It made no sense. There was no sign of a struggle, no scream, no one saw a car. But later, when detectives pressed her, Maddie mentioned something else. Rachel had been talking to a man earlier that afternoon. A stranger. He had stood near the trees away from the group and seemed to ask her something. Maddie could not hear what he said. She had assumed he was someone's father. This detail never made the news. Police investigated it quietly, but they found no one fitting Maddie's vague description. Over time, even Maddie began to question whether she had imagined it. As the weeks passed, speculation around Cedar Falls shifted from concern to suspicion. Rumors found cracks in the lives of those closest to Rachel. Some whispered about an older boy she had spoken to during summer camp, though no one could produce a name. Others mentioned her biology teacher, a man in his 30s with a reputation for paying too much attention to his students. The police had already cleared him, but gossip filled the silence where facts were missing. A few parents even speculated whether Rachel might have run away, although those who knew her best dismissed that idea outright. Rachel was not impulsive. She kept a journal color-coded her notebooks and once cried after losing a library book. Still, uncertainty fed the fear. Families watched their children more closely. Young girls were no longer allowed to walk home alone. The mayor promised additional patrols, but the damage had already been done. The town was now defined by an absence. Rachel's disappearance was not just a mystery. It became a wound. By the following winter, Briar Ridge Pond remained untouched. The town council had officially closed it, but no one had dared to skate there anyway. The wooden trail leading to the water was covered in old leaves and new snow, the benches half buried. The children who once begged their parents for extra minutes on the ice now passed by with lowered eyes. No one wanted to talk about what happened. It lingered like cold air that never left the lungs. Alan still drove by most mornings. Sometimes he parked, sometimes he did not. When he did, he would sit in the truck with the engine running, watching the empty field and the thin line of trees where Rachel had last been seen. Occasionally, he would get out and walk to the stump where her boots had been found, brushing away the snow with his gloved hand, hoping maybe a clue had been missed. A torn thread, a piece of paper, anything. But each time the snow revealed only more silence. He would stand there a few minutes longer, then return to the truck drive back to town, and sit in the diner pretending to read the paper until his coffee went cold. Joanne never returned to the pond. She had sealed that part of her world off both physically and emotionally. The door to Rachel's bedroom remained shut at all times. Inside the room was preserved exactly as it had been that December morning. The bed was made the purple quilt folded neatly. Her schoolbooks sat on the desk, her lucky coin collection lined up on the windowsill. Joanne vacuumed the hallway outside but never crossed the threshold. She kept a Polaroid of Rachel pinned above the sink in the kitchen, just beneath the cabinet where they used to keep the cereal. She began recording a journal on cassette tapes, talking as if she were speaking directly to her daughter. She would describe what she made for dinner, or how long it had snowed. She rarely listened to them afterward. Recording helped her sleep, at least on the nights when sleep came at all. In the spring, she mailed one tape to a post office box in Vermont that she had once used for a parenting magazine subscription. She had no idea why she chose that address, but doing it gave her a strange sense of relief. Rachel's absence shaped the routines of Cedar Falls. Her story became a line drawn quietly in time. Children who were 5 that winter grew up with the name Whitmore as a whisper of caution. Teenagers who had once been her classmates graduated, left town, and carried the story like a scar. Her teachers continued their lessons, but every December their eyes lingered a little longer on the attendance list. Every holiday season, local news ran a short segment reminding viewers that Rachel Whitmore had vanished 15 years ago and was still considered missing. Alan and Joanne granted no interviews after the 3rd year. They had grown weary of sympathy that expired too quickly. They no longer hosted relatives for the holidays. They kept their lights off on Halloween. On what would have been Rachel's 18th birthday, they received a card with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper that read, "You are not alone." The handwriting did not match anything they recognized. The card was never traced. Joanne kept it in a locked drawer with Rachel's birth certificate and her last school portrait. After the 5-year mark, some in town began speaking of Rachel in the past tense. It was not out of cruelty, but resignation. Sheriff Hulbridge, who had led the original investigation, retired and moved to Florida. The new sheriff, a younger man with 2 small children, reopened the file briefly, but found nothing new to pursue. He visited Alan and Joanne out of respect, and asked if they had kept in touch with any of Rachel's former friends. They had not. Maddie's family had moved to Wisconsin the year after the disappearance. Joanne still received Christmas cards from Maddie's mother, but she never wrote back. Alan donated to the Sheriff Department's Community Alert Fund every spring, but never attended town meetings again. Rachel's case became an unsolved reference point, mentioned when discussing new hires or policy changes. The truth was, her story had become too heavy to carry out loud. The morning of Rachel's 31st birthday arrived with a cold drizzle that left the streets of Cedar Falls slick and empty. Joanne stood by the window, her robe loosely tied at the waist, a half-empty mug of coffee cooling in her hand. She had not planned anything for the day, but she felt its weight before sunrise. The house was silent except for the ticking clock above the fridge and the low hum of the furnace. She had woken from a dream where Rachel stood at the edge of the pond, motionless, wearing her old middle school jacket. Joanne walked to the mailbox just after 9. She had not expected much, maybe a utility bill or a local circular. Instead, she found a small, padded envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was blocky, unfamiliar. Her breath caught as she turned it over. Her name was written in full, spelled correctly, including the middle initial. She carried the envelope into the kitchen with both hands. Alan had already left for the hardware store, unaware of what she now held. She laid the envelope on the table beside the cassette recorder she no longer used and stared at it for a long time. Joanne opened the package slowly, her fingers trembling. Inside was a single object wrapped in brown paper. She peeled the layers back and gasped as she recognized it. It was Rachel's skate tag. The small oval metal plate once attached to her laces for identification had her initials RW14 engraved in the center. Joanne had not seen it since the investigation in 1996. She had assumed it had been lost or discarded. Holding it now felt like time had folded in on itself. She turned it over, checking for signs of damage. It looked nearly new. The engraving was still sharp, and the edges showed no rust. But what unsettled her most was that the tag felt warm, as if it had been held recently. She placed it gently on the table, unable to take her eyes off it. She wondered if this meant Rachel was alive or if someone else wanted her to think so. The tag was more than a memory. It was proof that something had shifted. Alan returned home an hour later to find Joanne sitting at the kitchen table with the envelope beside her. He noticed the pale look on her face and asked if something was wrong. She slid the skate tag across the table toward him. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his calloused hands. He did not say anything for several minutes. His jaw tightened. He asked if the police had been notified, but Joanne shook her head. She did not want it taken away, logged into another forgotten folder. Instead, Alan called a friend who still worked in the sheriff's department. The friend agreed to come by after his shift and take a look. While they waited, Joanne stood over the sink, washing the same coffee cup 3 times. Alan sat in the living room holding the tag between his fingers, replaying the last 2 decades in fragments. The weight of the object was disproportionate to its size. It carried the weight of 17 lost years, unanswered prayers, and the faint echo of skates gliding across winter ice. The deputy who arrived that afternoon was respectful. He wore plain clothes and spoke in a low voice, not wanting to disturb the stillness of the house. He examined the tag, photographed it, and asked if they recognized the handwriting on the envelope. Joanne and Alan both said no. He offered to take it in for fingerprint testing, but Joanne refused. She did not want it out of her sight. The deputy left quietly, promising to write up a formal report. That night, Alan placed the tag inside a glass jar with a lid and set it on Rachel's old bookshelf. Joanne sat on the edge of the bed staring at the jar until she finally lay down. Neither of them slept. The tag had changed something. It had reopened everything. And beneath the fear, beneath the shock, there was something else. A tremor of hope. Fragile, dangerous, but alive. The following day, Alan took the envelope to the regional lab himself. He waited in line for over an hour before a technician finally called him to the desk. The technician, a young woman who looked barely old enough to drink, asked for his identification and carefully placed the envelope in a protective sleeve. Alan asked how long results would take. The technician said several weeks, maybe longer. There was a backlog. He nodded and left without saying anything more. On the drive home, he kept the windows rolled up and the heat on full blast. When he pulled into the driveway, Joanne was sitting on the front steps in her coat. She held a sheet of lined notebook paper in her lap. Alan stepped closer and saw faint writing. It was a note tucked in the envelope he had overlooked. Joanne read it aloud once, then folded it carefully. The note said only one thing. I did not forget. That was all. No signature, no explanation. Joanne did not tell Alan when she packed her suitcase. She moved quietly that Thursday morning, folding sweaters and tucking Rachel's old ribbon into a side pocket. She had written a note and placed it on the kitchen counter beside the jar that held the skate tag. The note explained that she needed to follow the trail herself. She needed to see the place from which the envelope had been mailed. Alan would not have stopped her, but she feared the weight of his caution. Joanne fueled the car at the station near the edge of town and headed east. The drive to Vermont took over 13 hours, and she stopped only once at a diner in Ohio, where she ate toast and drank a cup of weak coffee. The sky darkened as she passed the state line, and by nightfall she had checked into a roadside motel. The room smelled of bleach and old linens, but it was quiet. She pulled the curtain tight and sat at the small desk. She placed the envelope and the note on the desk beside a folded state map. It was the first time in years she had done something alone that was not tied to grief. The next morning, Joanne walked through the small town center where the postmark originated. The buildings were neat and trimmed with wooden signs. A bakery served warm bread from a side window, and the library still used paper cards to track book returns. She visited the post office and spoke with a woman at the front desk. The woman wore glasses on a chain and tapped her nails on the counter as Joanne explained what she was looking for. The woman said she remembered handling a plain padded envelope addressed to Cedar Falls. She could not recall who dropped it off. Joanne thanked her and wandered the streets with a growing sense of both urgency and doubt. She stopped inside a thrift store with handwritten signs and racks of winter coats. Her eyes moved over the colors until she saw something oddly familiar. A pink parka hung near the back wall. The stitching around the collar looked nearly identical to Rachel's jacket. She lifted the sleeve and saw a small tear near the cuff. Joanne asked the clerk where the coat came from, but the woman shrugged and said donations came in daily. Joanne bought the coat and brought it back to the motel. That night, Joanne examined the parka again. She opened the inside lining and ran her fingers along the fabric. She found something stiff near the seam. She carefully pulled at the stitching until a folded paper slipped out. It was brittle and yellowed like it had been there for years. It was a bulletin from a local church. On the back, someone had scribbled a note in pencil. It read simply, Rachel W. Winter Choir, 2009. Joanne stared at the date. The coat was real. Rachel had worn it 13 years after she vanished. Joanne's breath caught in her throat as she sat back in the bed. She now held something more than a memory. She held confirmation. Rachel had lived beyond that winter day. Joanne placed the note inside her wallet and wrapped the jacket around her lap. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the window and watched the parking lot until the sky began to lighten. In the pale morning sun, she felt something that she had not dared to feel in years. She felt forward motion. Joanne returned to the streets the next day with renewed focus. She visited the small church listed on the bulletin. It sat on a quiet road framed by pine trees and looked nearly unchanged from the photo printed in the bulletin. She asked to see the records from the Winter Choir group in 2009, but the church secretary explained that the records were limited, and many were damaged in a basement flood. Joanne sat in the pews afterward, listening to the sound of her own breath. The sanctuary was cold and smelled faintly of wax and wood. Before she left, the secretary gave her a list of choir members from that year that had been recovered. She scanned the names. Some were common, some were others unfamiliar. But one stood out. Lynn Warner. Joanne circled the name. She did not recognize it, but something about it felt placed, made. She thanked the secretary and left quietly. That evening, she searched the name at the town library computer. A reference popped up from an old diner payroll document. Joanne took down the address. She had found her next stop. Joanne drove to the address she had found at the library, a modest diner tucked between an old hardware store and a florist. The building had chipped paint and a rusted sign that read simply Rosie's. The parking lot was empty except for a delivery truck and a silver sedan. She parked her car along the curb and stepped inside. The smell of frying bacon and coffee grounds hit her immediately. The booths were lined with red vinyl, and a man in his 40s stood behind the counter wiping a plate with a towel. Joanne sat at the far end of the room and ordered a tea. She asked the man if he had worked there long. He nodded and said almost 20 years. She asked about a girl named Lynn Warner, who might have worked there around 2009. His brow furrowed as he leaned on the counter. He said there had been a Lynn. She was quiet, polite, and never caused trouble. He remembered she left suddenly without giving notice. Joanne pressed gently, asking if he had ever spoken to her outside of work. He said no. She came in, did her job, and left. He assumed she had moved on. Joanne stayed seated for nearly an hour, sipping her tea and watching the few patrons come and go. Near the end of her visit, a waitress with gray-streaked hair approached her booth. She sat down without asking. She said she had overheard Joanne asking about Lynn. The waitress lowered her voice and said she had always thought something was off. Lynn never gave her last name when she introduced herself. She seemed jumpy, always looking out the window as if she expected someone. One time a man came in asking questions and Lynn disappeared during her break and never returned. The waitress said she had tried to call her afterward, but the number she gave on her employee form was disconnected. Joanne asked if the man was described or remembered. The waitress said he wore a blue jacket and had a limp. Joanne's chest tightened. That was the same detail Maddie had once given to investigators about a man near the pond. Joanne asked if the diner had cameras back then. The waitress said they did, but doubted any footage remained. Joanne thanked her and left a large tip. As she stepped outside, she felt both closer and further away. That evening, Joanne checked into another motel closer to the highway. The room was sparse, but it offered Wi-Fi, and she used her phone to search through archived news stories and public records. She typed the name Lynn Warner and filtered by state and date. She found nothing concrete. She tried image searches using Rachel's middle school photo, but the results led nowhere. She searched social media platforms, but found only inactive or private accounts. After hours of scrolling, her eyes burned, and she finally closed the laptop. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the waitress's words about the man with the limp. She had not thought about that detail in years. Joanne reached for her phone and called Alan. It was the first time they had spoken since she left. She told him about the coat, the bulletin, the name, and now the diner. He listened without interruption. When she paused, he said he would come if she needed him. Joanne said not yet. She needed to follow this path while it was still hers to walk. The next morning, Joanne returned to the diner just after opening. The cook from the day before handed her a small envelope. Inside was a printed photo, faded and slightly out of focus. It was from the old surveillance system. He had found it while checking the archives for old tax forms. The photo showed a young woman in a black turtleneck and jeans exiting through the back door. She walked with her head down, her posture familiar. Her profile was partially visible, and Joanne's breath caught. It looked like Rachel. Her hair was darker, her body slightly fuller, but the chin and nose were unmistakable. The timestamp was blurry, but the year 2009 was clear. Joanne thanked him and stepped outside to her car. She sat behind the wheel and stared at the photo. Her hands trembled. This was not just another rumor or hunch. This was proof. She started the engine and opened her notebook. She scribbled everything she knew so far. A pink coat in a thrift store, a bulletin hidden inside, a name that matched a payroll record, a photo of a girl who looked like her daughter, a waitress who remembered the fear in her eyes. It was enough. Joanne checked into a quiet motel just outside the edge of town, a pale blue building with weathered paint and plastic plants in the lobby. The clerk handed her a brass key attached to a large plastic tag with the number 12 on it. The hallway smelled of bleach and old curtains. Her room had a small desk, a narrow bed, and a nightstand with a Bible inside the drawer. She placed her bag near the chair and sat for a long time without unpacking. Her body was tired, but her thoughts would not slow down. She laid the photo from the diner on the desk, smoothing out the edges with her palm. The girl in the photo wore the same curve of a half smile that Rachel used to give whenever she was nervous. Joanne turned on the lamp beside the bed and tried to read, but the words swam on the page. The motel was quiet. Too quiet. Around midnight, she thought she heard footsteps in the hallway, then a faint knock at a distant door. She sat up and listened. Nothing followed. She turned off the light and tried to sleep, clutching Rachel's skate tag beneath her pillow. In the morning, Joanne opened her door to retrieve the local newspaper, which had been slid under the frame. But tucked beneath the edge of the paper was something else. A folded piece of lined notebook paper with shaky handwriting. Her name was written at the top. She froze. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The note said, "You are close. Stop now." Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. Her heartbeat quickened. She scanned the parking lot but saw no one. The cars were the same as the night before. The air was cold and still. She locked the door behind her and sat on the bed, trying to calm her breathing. The message could mean anything, but it sounded like a warning. She checked the front desk, but the clerk claimed not to have seen anyone deliver anything to her room. Joanne returned to her room and sat quietly. She felt watched, but she could not tell from where. She tried calling Alan, but hung up before the call went through. She needed time to think. She needed to decide whether the message meant danger or something else entirely. Later that afternoon, Joanne asked the clerk for the sign-in sheet, explaining that she thought someone had slipped a note under her door. The clerk hesitated, but eventually allowed her a quick look. Her name was clearly written on line 7. She scanned the sheet and froze. On line 8, the next name down was a name she recognized. A. Whitmore. Alan's full name was written in familiar handwriting, but she knew he had not come. She had spoken to him only once since she arrived in Vermont. She called his cell immediately. He answered from Cedar Falls, unaware of what she had found. He confirmed he had not traveled. Joanne thanked him, heart pounding. Someone else had signed in using his name. She alerted the manager, who promised to look into it. The sense of being watched intensified. She checked the lock on her door twice. That night she kept the lights on and placed a chair under the doorknob. She was no longer certain who wanted her to stop searching or why they were using names that belonged to her family. The following morning, Joanne visited the room next to hers. The door stood closed and no sound came from inside. She knocked softly. No answer. She returned to the front desk and asked who was staying in room 13. The clerk said the room had been paid in cash under the name Richard Lane. Joanne asked if there was a record of when he checked in. The clerk looked through the book and found that Richard Lane had checked in the same day she did. Joanne returned to her room and searched through her notes. The name Richard Lane belonged to an old family friend who had passed away nearly a decade earlier. Her suspicion deepened. She now knew someone was not only watching her, but also using names from her past. That level of knowledge could not be random. It had to be personal. Someone knew Rachel, someone knew them. Joanne did not know whether it was meant as intimidation or protection, but it confirmed something she had felt for days. Rachel was not just a memory to someone else. She was a secret, and secrets were always guarded. Joanne left the motel before sunrise. She had not slept more than an hour, her mind too tangled with questions and half-formed fears. The note still rested in her coat pocket, creased from how tightly she had folded it. Her hands felt cold, even with gloves. She drove with no exact destination, letting instinct guide her past neighborhoods and frozen fields. By mid-morning, she reached the edge of town, where the river curved behind a stretch of birch trees. She parked near a walking path and stepped out. The ground crunched under her boots. The river moved slowly with patches of ice near the banks and steam rising from its warmer center. As she stood near the edge watching the current, a figure appeared several yards away. A man in a heavy coat and knit cap stood with his back to her, hands in his pockets. He turned slowly and looked at her. His face was unfamiliar, but calm. He said nothing. Joanne did not speak either. For several seconds, they simply stared at each other, not in fear, but with unspoken recognition. She felt that he was waiting, not for confrontation, for permission. The wind picked up slightly. He finally stepped forward. The man moved closer, stopping a few feet away. His voice was soft and weathered when he spoke. He said he had known her daughter. He did not offer a name. Joanne did not interrupt. He told her that Rachel had come to Vermont under a different name and had lived in hiding for years. He said she had been running from someone who once knew her in Cedar Falls. Not a stranger. Someone from within the community. Joanne's knees weakened slightly. She steadied herself against a tree. The man continued. He said Rachel had worked at a bookstore, sung in a local choir, and lived in an apartment above a bakery. He said she had left suddenly in 2010 after seeing someone from her past. He did not say who. He handed Joanne a folded photograph from his coat pocket. It was a picture of Rachel standing behind a counter with books stacked beside her. She looked older, her hair longer, but her eyes unmistakable. Joanne stared at the image, her throat tight, unable to speak. The man said Rachel had asked him to protect her memory. He said he had broken that promise by speaking to Joanne now. Joanne asked him why Rachel had run. The man looked toward the river. He said Rachel had witnessed something in Cedar Falls before she disappeared, something she should not have seen. He did not know the details, only that she was afraid, not just for herself but for her parents. She had written journals and mailed letters to an address that no longer existed. The man had collected some of those pages and kept them hidden. He said he would give them to Joanne, but only if she promised not to share them with the police immediately. He said there were still people who might be watching, who might try to silence what Rachel had hidden. Joanne nodded slowly. Her voice shook as she asked where Rachel was now. The man said he did not know. He had not seen her in over 10 years. He had sent the skate tag as a signal, a test, to see if anyone was still looking. He said he was surprised when Joanne came. He thought the trail had gone cold. Joanne said she had never stopped searching. She never would. The man reached into his coat and handed Joanne a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were 5 small notebooks, each labeled with a different date. The covers were soft with age, the pages filled with slanted handwriting. Joanne clutched them close. The man told her to read them in private, to understand before making decisions. He warned that not everything inside would be easy. He then turned and walked toward the woods, disappearing between the trees. Joanne stood by the river for several minutes after he left. Her breath came in slow clouds. She pressed the journals to her chest. The snow began to fall lightly. She returned to her car and sat behind the wheel, not starting the engine. She opened the first notebook and flipped to the first page. The words written in Rachel's voice felt immediate and intimate. Joanne's eyes filled with tears. She read the first entry slowly, her heart racing with every line. Rachel had survived. She had made a life. She had written it all down, and now Joanne held that life in her hands. Joanne sat at the motel desk late into the night. The 5 journals spread out before her like chapters of a daughter she had never truly known. Each notebook was labeled by hand with simple titles. Winter 1996, Vermont Years, Bookstore Days, The Quiet Year, Last Pages. She opened the first slowly. The handwriting began small and uncertain, then grew steadier. Rachel wrote about the day she disappeared in vivid detail. She described skating with Maddie, the cold that stung her cheeks, and the moment she noticed a man watching from the edge of the woods. She wrote that she knew him, though she never mentioned his name. He had taught her something once. He should not have been there. She described feeling afraid, but unsure whether it was instinct or memory. He called to her. She had walked toward the woods not because she wanted to, but because she did not want her friends to hear him. She said the man had once made her promise not to speak about what she saw in his office during a school function, something hidden in a drawer, a photo that did not belong, a girl that was not from town. Rachel had remembered. The entries in the second journal described her escape. She had run that night, slipping away through the woods before calling a number she had memorized from a magazine. It connected her to a youth runaway hotline. They told her how to get to a shelter in Ohio. She used the cash she had saved from babysitting. She never told them her real name. She wrote about lying to the workers at the shelter and learning how to blend in. She picked a new name from a paperback novel someone left on a bus seat. Lynn Warner. She made it simple, easy to remember. She moved through 3 different states before settling in Vermont. She wrote about cutting her hair, finding jobs where no one asked questions, and always staying close to bus routes. She said she missed her mother most when she saw mothers and daughters laughing in bookstores. She avoided holidays. She described watching snow fall on rooftops and thinking about the pond. She said the ice never left her dreams. She dreamed of silence. She dreamed of her father calling her name. She wrote that sometimes she woke up crying without knowing why. The 3rd journal focused on her years at the bookstore. She had found a place that felt calm, a rhythm that made her believe she might stay. She wrote about folding flyers for book clubs and organizing the children's reading section. She wrote about a customer who visited every Tuesday, always buying a poetry book. She wondered if he was lonely. She described learning how to sing again after joining a church choir. She said music helped her breathe. For the first time, she used the word peace. She wrote about a bakery owner who lived upstairs and let her rent a small room for low rent. She described the smell of cinnamon in the mornings and how she had grown used to walking in snow. She kept a journal hidden under the floorboard and wrote that she felt safe until a man in a blue coat began showing up near the store. She said he looked like someone from Cedar Falls. She did not wait to find out. She packed her things in a single bag and left one night without saying goodbye. She took only the notebooks and a photo of her parents from her 6th grade recital. The 4th notebook was the quietest. There were fewer entries. Rachel wrote about living in a small town with no name signs and working at a roadside motel. She said she spoke less. She kept her head down. She began mailing small objects to post office boxes she found in old letters from home. She mailed a library card, a bookmark, a birthday candle, and finally the skate tag. She said if her mother received it, she would know someone was still listening. Rachel said she was tired, but not broken. She was learning to stop running. She wondered if her parents would recognize her voice if they heard it over the phone. She said she wanted to call. She never did. The entries ended with a list: favorite songs, favorite meals, a memory of sitting in the grass outside her middle school and watching clouds. She had not written an address. She had not written a goodbye. Just the words, "Keep looking. I am still here." Joanne returned to Cedar Falls just before spring touched the edges of the trees with soft green. The drive home was long and quiet. She kept the journals wrapped carefully in a wool scarf on the passenger seat. Every few hours she glanced at them, as if afraid they might disappear. The town looked smaller than she remembered. The streets had fewer children playing outside. The corner store had new signage and fresh paint, but the old brick library and the park swings remained unchanged. She parked in front of her house and turned off the engine. The curtains had not moved. She stepped inside to find Alan in the living room, sitting in the chair he had moved near the front window 2 years ago. He looked up slowly. His eyes moved to her hands where she clutched the journals. He stood without speaking. Joanne walked toward him and handed him the scarf bundle. His hands trembled as he took them. He asked only one question. "Is she alive?" Joanne's voice cracked as she answered, "I believe so." They sat down together on the couch and opened the first notebook. Their daughter's voice came back to them in ink and silence. Alan read aloud from the beginning. He paused often to gather himself. He stopped when he came across the entry about Rachel's dreams. He said he remembered her crying in her sleep the week before she disappeared. Joanne nodded. She had always suspected something had frightened Rachel, but no one had listened closely enough. She had been too busy with work. Alan had been too quick to dismiss little things, a skipped lunch, a forgotten book. Now every moment felt sharpened by hindsight. Joanne leaned against his shoulder. The house around them felt warmer somehow, not because grief had left, but because the truth had entered. Rachel's words filled the room. They spoke of fear, but also strength, of leaving not in anger, but in panic. She had tried to protect herself and the people she loved, and she had succeeded in both. She had survived. That mattered most. Joanne whispered that she would never stop searching. Alan nodded. He said they would finish the trail together. They would go wherever the next page led them. They would carry her story forward. The sheriff came by 2 days later after Joanne called and asked for a private meeting. She handed him copies of Rachel's journals, but she kept the originals. She explained that Rachel had run because she feared someone who still lived nearby. She gave no name. The sheriff listened carefully and asked no questions she could not answer. He promised to begin a quiet inquiry and review old files. Joanne asked him not to involve media or reopen public channels until she gave permission. He agreed. He had 2 daughters of his own. He understood. He said there was a chance Rachel might reach out if she learned the truth had finally been told in safety. He told Joanne to keep the line open. Joanne nodded. After he left, she walked to the backyard and sat on the swing Rachel used to love. The grass was damp beneath her feet. She looked toward the sky and whispered that she was sorry, not for failing, but for not knowing, for not seeing. For every moment she had assumed safety instead of asking again. She made a promise aloud. If Rachel returned, she would never ask her to explain the past. She would only hold her. Weeks passed. Joanne resumed simple routines. She visited the diner alone once a week and always brought a copy of the photo of Rachel behind the bookstore counter. Some people recognized her. Others only offered kind words. One day she received a letter in the mailbox with no name and no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Rachel stood near a lake, her hair longer, her smile quiet. She held a small dog in her arms. A folded note inside read, "Thank you for reading. I am still watching." Joanne pressed the photo to her chest and closed her eyes. She told Alan that night, and they lit a candle near the old family photo shelf. They did not need anything else. The evidence was real. Rachel was somewhere safe. She might not be ready to return, but she was not lost. Joanne wrote a letter back and mailed it to the Vermont post office. She did not ask for more. She only said, "I love you." That is all. Months later, Rachel's old room became a space of warmth again. Joanne placed the journals in a wooden box beside the bed. She left the bed made and the curtains open. Some mornings she sat there with tea and reread the entries. She smiled at parts where Rachel wrote about silly customers or favorite pastries. She cried during pages about long walks through snow. The journals became a map, not to find her, but to understand her. Joanne knew now that stories do not end when someone disappears. Sometimes they only pause. Sometimes they grow in quiet places and wait to be read. Joanne and Alan continued their days with a steadiness that came not from closure, but from clarity. Their daughter had endured. She had told the truth in her own voice. She had trusted them to hear it. That trust was enough. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss another mystery. We want to hear from you. What do you think really happened to Rachel, and where are you watching from today? Share your thoughts in the comments below.